All right, ready to dive into one of history's most debated events, the JFK assassination. It's a day that still has people talking, debating, even decades later. And, you've given us a really interesting script to break down. It looks at this event from all these different angles, so let's try to sift through it all, the theories, the evidence, all of it.
Yeah, you're right. It's one of those things. Just won't go away. November 22nd, 1963. Picture it. JFK, he's in that motorcade driving through Dealey Plaza, Dallas, and then shots. The country just goes into shock and mourning. And even today, all these years later, people still want to know what happened, why it happened.
Absolutely, and the script jumps right into it, doesn't waste any time. It starts with what we all learned in school, Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone gunman, that book depository. But, there's always been something about that official story that makes people wonder, right?
Totally. I mean, the Warren Commission, they spent all that time investigating, and they decided, yep, it was Oswald all by himself. But right away, people were skeptical. And not just, the conspiracy theory types. The House Select Committee, they did their own investigation in '79, and they concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy.
Hmm.
And these guys, they weren't messing around. They could get witnesses, evidence, the whole 9 yards. And they came out and basically said, we don't agree with the Warren report.
That's a huge deal. So if Oswald wasn't alone, who else was involved? And what would their motive be? I mean, it's almost too big to think about.
Right. The script points to some pretty interesting stuff that casts doubt on that lone gunman idea. Take the Zapruder film, for example, that home movie, the one that actually caught the assassination on film.
Everyone's seen that footage, but how much can you actually see in 26 seconds? Especially with a shaky camera like that?
You'd be surprised. People have been analyzing that film frame by frame for years. And one of the biggest things people argue about is the magic bullet theory. This theory says that one bullet went through President Kennedy and then injured John Connally, the Texas governor, who was also in the car. The Warren Commission, they really leaned on that theory.
Wait, one bullet, two people, all those injuries? That sounds a little hard to believe.
Yeah, and this is where the doubts about Oswald start to make sense. If that bullet couldn't have done all that damage, it changes everything. Was there another shooter? Was it staged? These questions, this uncertainty, it's like fuel for all these conspiracy theories.
And speaking of which, the script doesn't shy away from the grassy knoll. It's almost like a symbol of all the doubts surrounding the assassination.
The grassy knoll, man. Witnesses said they heard shots from over there. Some even described seeing shady people hanging around. We don't have any hard proof of that. But they never really investigated it properly right after it happened, so it just makes the whole thing more suspicious.
Okay, so we've got a shaky official story, bullet holes that don't make sense, and a mysterious grassy knoll. What's it all mean? Who benefits from Kennedy's death? This is where the script gets really interesting.
Okay, but keep in mind, we're just talking about theories here, not stating facts. But yeah, the script lays out some pretty big potential players. First, you've got Lyndon B. Johnson taking over after Kennedy. Did he have a motive? Some people say he saw Kennedy as a roadblock, stopping him from getting what he wanted.
Right, and then there's always the CIA. Kennedy and the CIA, they weren't exactly best friends after the Bay of Pigs thing.
Exactly. Kennedy was furious about the Bay of Pigs, and he even talked about cutting back the CIA's power. That had to make them nervous, right?
And we can't forget organized crime. Kennedy's administration, they were tough on the mob. Those guys aren't exactly known for letting things slide.
You said it. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, he was Attorney General, and he was going after organized crime with everything he had. He made some serious enemies. Did they see Kennedy as a threat they needed to get rid of? It wouldn't be the first time, that's for sure.
It's like going down a rabbit hole. You start with one question, and it leads to a dozen more. But then the script goes even deeper. It starts talking about these suspicious deaths connected to the assassination, and it's straight out of a conspiracy thriller.
No kidding. It's one thing to suspect a conspiracy, but then you see what happened to people who got too close, people who knew too much. It's chilling.
Exactly. Like Jack Ruby, the guy who shot Oswald. He dies in prison from lung cancer, which, happens. But a lot of people think he was silenced, kept from revealing what he knew.
Definitely suspicious. Ruby always said he acted alone, but some people think he was a pawn in a bigger game, a patsy. And then there's Dorothy Kilgallen, that journalist who was looking into the assassination.
Didn't she say she found something big, something that could blow the whole case open? What happened there?
She dies in '65. Really strange circumstances. Officially, it was alcohol and pills. But some people think she was murdered to keep quiet. And then, to make it even weirder, some of her notes about the JFK case, they disappeared.
Wow. It's like something out of a spy movie. If these were hits, it means the conspiracy goes way beyond one gunman. And then there's the CIA, the FBI. The script makes a big deal about their role.
Yeah, their involvement, it's still a big question mark. Some people say they messed up, they didn't put the pieces together, and that's why it happened. But other people, and the script seems to lean this way, they think those agencies were covering something up, maybe even involved somehow.
And all those files, all those documents about the assassination that are still classified, it just makes it harder to figure out what's true and what's not.
Totally. I mean, even when Trump released all those documents in 2017, a lot of them were blacked out, like they didn't want us to see parts of them. What are they still hiding? It makes you wonder.
It feels like the more you find out, the less you know. So how do we even try to make sense of all these theories, all these unanswered questions?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The JFK assassination, it's not just a history book thing. It's like a puzzle, and we've lost half the pieces. People see what they want to see in it. Some people say it was a tragic accident, wrong place, wrong time. But others, they see a huge conspiracy, people in power pulling the strings.
And the script lays it all out, lets you decide for yourself, which is kind of refreshing.
Right. But even if we say Oswald wasn't alone, the big question is still there. Who and why? Was it Johnson grabbing power? Was it the CIA getting even? Was it a mob hit? Or something else entirely? It's enough to drive you crazy thinking about it.
It's like trying to solve a riddle that keeps changing. Every answer just leads to more questions. But with all this focus on the conspiracy theories, I'm curious, what about the human side of things? What does the script say about that?
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in all the what-ifs and maybes.
Right.
But there were real people affected by this, Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to forget. The script actually, it does a good job of reminding us to think about that.
Right. Like, this wasn't just some political game.
No.
This was a husband, a father.
A brother. People who cared about him, people close to it. The script doesn't spend a lot of time on it. But it reminds us that behind all the theories, all the evidence, there are people who lost someone that day.
It makes you think.
It does.
You can analyze the politics, the evidence, all of that, but we can't really, truly understand what it was like for the people who knew him, who loved him.
No, we can't. And that actually leads to another thing the script brings up, the legacy of the JFK assassination.
It's still with us, even now.
It's not just a date in a history book. It's, a moment in time frozen. It changed how we think about power, about truth, about how fragile life can be.
Like this shared trauma, something we're still trying to make sense of.
I think that's a good way to put it. And because there are so many unanswered questions, it just makes it harder to move on.
So what do we do? Just accept that we'll never really know everything? Or keep searching for those missing pieces?
That's what the script wants us to think about, I think. It doesn't give you a straight answer, which is fine.
Yeah.
The JFK assassination, it makes you think critically, makes you question everything.
It's like you were saying before about history being a conversation.
Exactly. And this is a conversation that's still going on. It's not over.
And it's a conversation that forces us to look at some uncomfortable things about our leaders, about ourselves. Maybe that's why it's still so fascinating.
Maybe it is.
Well, there you have it. We've looked at the official story. We've dived into the conspiracies, talked about the impact of it all. What do you think? What are your takeaways?
Yeah, do your own research. Think for yourself. Don't just take our word for it.
The JFK assassination, it's more than just a history lesson. It's a puzzle, a mystery. And maybe it's a story that's still being written.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep searching for the truth.
All right, everyone, get ready. Because today we are diving headfirst into the world of chemtrails.
Ooh, juicy.
That's right. We're talking about those wispy white lines you see trailing behind airplanes and whether they're as innocent as they appear.
Yeah, a lot of people have sent us theories about this one. It's definitely captured people's imaginations.
It seems like everyone's got a theory about what those trails really are.
Oh, they do. They do.
We're talking weather control, population control. Heck, even mind control's been thrown around.
It's like a grab bag of anxieties all pointed at the sky, right?
It really is, and we are going to unpack it all.
I love it. Let's do it.
You sent over a whole stack of articles, even a podcast script about this.
Yeah, there's no shortage of opinions on this topic, that's for sure.
So, where do we even begin? What are chemtrails actually supposed to be, according to these theories?
Okay, so the term chemtrail itself is already hinting at something suspicious, right?
Right, it implies it's more than just a contrail.
Exactly. It suggests those white streaks aren't just condensation from the plane's engines, but something else entirely. chemicals being deliberately released for some hidden agenda.
Okay, so let's break that down. For those who haven't spent their time going down internet rabbit holes, what's the difference between a chemtrail and a regular old contrail?
So a contrail, that's just a visible trail of condensed water vapor.
Like what we see when we breathe out on a cold day.
Exactly, except this is happening way up high in the atmosphere where it's super cold. Planes' engines expel hot, humid air, and when that hits the cold air, boom, you get condensation, those little water droplets that form a cloud-like trail.
Makes sense. So then chemtrails, at least according to the theories, are
Right.
something more nefarious.
Exactly. The theories claim that those trails contain additional substances, chemicals beyond just water vapor, and that they're being deliberately spread for. Well, that's where the theories really go wild.
All right, so let's talk about some of those wild theories.
Hmm.
What are some of the most popular reasons people give for why these so-called chemtrails are being sprayed?
Well, one of the biggest ones you hear is weather control. Some people believe that governments or other powerful groups are using chemtrails to manipulate the weather on a global scale. We're talking creating droughts, intensifying storms.
Weaponizing the weather.
Exactly. It's some pretty intense stuff.
So instead of just making a few rain clouds, they're talking about controlling entire weather systems.
Basically. And that's where things start to get really far-fetched.
Right, because we do have cloud seeding, which has been around for a while now, but it's very localized.
You're right on the money. We've got cloud seeding, where we use things like silver iodide to influence rainfall on a small scale. But to manipulate weather patterns on the scale these chemtrail theories suggest, that would require an insane amount of resources, something that just wouldn't be possible to keep under wraps.
Right. And wouldn't a government with that kind of power and technology have bigger, more urgent issues to deal with on a global scale?
That's a really good question. And that kind of gets to the heart of another big factor driving these theories: distrust in authority, especially governments.
Right, that whole big brother is watching you idea taken to a new level.
Exactly. And I get it. History is full of examples of governments doing shady things in secret. So it's not a completely unfounded fear.
So when people see something strange or unexplained happening in the sky, and they already have that underlying distrust.
See, it's easy to see how those fears can take hold and grow, especially with the internet fanning those flames, which is something we'll be getting into more a bit later.
We will. But first, let's dive a little deeper into the evidence. We left off talking about distrust and authority in the internet. But what about the proof? What kind of evidence do people point to when they're talking about chemtrails?
Well, a lot of it comes down to eyewitness accounts.
People claiming to have seen these spraying operations firsthand?
Some, yeah, claiming to have insider knowledge or saying they witnessed something off about the trails themselves.
Okay, like what? What kind of things are we talking about here?
Some common ones are trails that seem to hang around in the sky for a long time or spread out in these weird, unnatural-looking ways.
People see those and think, aha, normal contrails don't do that.
Exactly. That's usually the logic, and it makes sense. It would be compelling, but it all comes down to understanding the science behind contrails.
Because they can linger, right,
Yeah.
and change shape depending on what is it.
You got it. Atmospheric conditions, humidity, temperature, wind patterns, they all play a huge role in how a contrail will behave.
So that chemtrail someone saw spreading out across the sky could really just be a regular contrail being pushed around by high-altitude winds.
Exactly. The atmosphere is way more complex than we often give it credit for.
It's kind of like saying every weirdly shaped cloud is proof of weather manipulation, when really it's just nature doing its thing.
Perfect analogy. And this whole thing about atmospheric conditions, it also applies to another big piece of evidence people bring up: weird substances found in soil or water samples.
Like they'll find something unusual and claim it's proof of chemicals being sprayed from the sky.
Precisely. But when you think about it, it's far more likely that those substances come from, well, pollution. We live in a world with factories, cars, all sorts of things that pump stuff into the environment.
Right. It's pretty hard to ignore that when we're talking about contamination.
Exactly. So blaming those things on some shadowy aerial spraying program,
Yeah.
it's a stretch, to say the least.
A classic case of correlation, not equaling causation.
100%. Just because you saw it playing around the same time something funky showed up in your garden doesn't mean those two things are related.
But it's easy to see how our brains connect those dots, especially when we want to see a connection.
It speaks to a bigger issue we see with a lot of conspiracy theories: confirmation bias.
That's where we tend to favor information that confirms what we already believe, even if that information isn't totally accurate.
Right, if you already think chemtrails are real, and then you hear about someone finding something strange in their rainwater.
You're more likely to see it as proof of what you already believe, instead of considering other possibilities.
And that's where the internet really comes into play.
Because now you have this perfect storm of confirmation bias and algorithms designed to show you more of what you already seem to be interested in, even if it's not true.
Exactly. You go down one chemtrail rabbit hole, and suddenly your entire online world is flooded with that stuff.
That's like those algorithms are saying, oh, you like conspiracy theories. Here are 1,000 more.
Right. And it creates this really distorted view of reality, like everyone agrees with you, even when the evidence says otherwise, which can have real consequences beyond just online debates.
So we've talked about the theories, the evidence people bring up, and how the internet can amplify these ideas. But where does that leave us? What's the real-world impact of all this? It can't just be online debates, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it can go further than just online discussions.
People actually acting on these beliefs.
Sadly, yeah, we've seen cases where fear and misinformation about chemtrails have spilled over into the real world.
Like what?
Protests, for example, petitions, people even aiming lasers at airplanes because of this.
Wow. That's taking things to a whole other level.
It really shows you how quickly distrust and misinformation that might start online can impact how people act in their everyday lives.
It also makes you wonder, doesn't getting caught up in this chemtrail idea distract from the real environmental problems we should be focused on?
That's a really important point. You know, regardless of what you believe about chemtrails, there are very real, very serious environmental issues we have to deal with.
Air pollution, for one.
Exactly. Climate change, industrial contamination. These are things that have a huge measurable effect on the planet, on our health. And getting caught up in these theories, it can take energy away from those really important issues.
It's like worrying about a small leak when the whole roof is about to cave in.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have good critical thinking skills, to be able to evaluate information, especially what we see online, with a critical eye.
So after this deep dive into chemtrails and all these theories, what's the takeaway? What's the verdict? Are we being sprayed or not?
Well, based on all the scientific evidence we have, it's highly unlikely that these trails are anything other than just that. Contrails, condensation trails from planes. Of course, it's good to be skeptical, to question things, but we also have to be sure that we base our conclusions on evidence and not just speculation or what we see in a YouTube video, right?
Absolutely. Just because something sounds exciting or scary doesn't make it true.
Right. It's about thinking critically, being media literate, and trusting reliable sources of information.
Because ultimately, questioning what we see, considering different viewpoints, sticking to evidence-based information, those are the tools that will help us understand not just this issue, but any complicated issue we face.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And who knows, maybe in the process of approaching these topics with an open mind and asking questions, we might even stumble across something new and fascinating, even if it's not quite as dramatic as a global conspiracy.
Now, that's a good point. Always keep learning.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into chemtrails and the world of conspiracy theories. Remember to stay curious and question everything. Until next time.